This is a super controversial claim. It captures the idea that humans are selfish, which some people find intuitive, but I think others who have a kind of more optimistic spirit about humanity might find a little startling and want to reject. So we need to ask the psychological egoist to give us reason. Like, why should we believe this view, right? Why not think that there are some altruistic desires that are also ultimate, and that sometimes we act for the sake of others for their own sake and not for the sake of anything else? Convince us, egoist. We're just going to close by looking at a bad argument for psychological egoism. This comes from the Feinberg reading. We're going to talk about why it's bad, and this is just going to help us to get clearer on what we're looking for in a good argument. And then next time, in the next set of videos, we'll have a discussion of the argument that we discussed from Plato in the Republic, the Ring of Gyges argument, which you may think at the end of the day is still bad. In other words, you may think that one or more of those premises of that argument is false, but it's not as obviously bad as the argument we're about to discuss. Okay, so here's a bad argument that I'm just going to call argument A, because I don't even know if it's ever been defended in print, but Feinberg discusses it as what he thinks of as a common kind of defense of egoism, that it's important to just clear away before we get to something more plausible. And the common defense of egoism that he's pointing to goes like this. Look, your actions and my actions, but let's focus on you, are all ultimately motivated by your own desires. Kind of by definition, right? Motives are desires that cause actions. Like, your desires aren't the causes of my actions. It's my desires that are causes of my actions. And your desires are the causes of your actions. So that seems plausible. A1, that's the first premise. Your actions are ultimately motivated by desires that are your own. Therefore, this is the conclusion, your actions are ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. That's just another way to say that PE is true. Everything you do is ultimately motivated, since it's motivated by your desires, it's motivated by egoistic desires. That's just what it means to be egoistic, to have to do with you, right? Okay, so this argument obviously isn't very good. What's wrong with it? Well, remember, we always want to ask ourselves two questions when we're encountering an argument. In order to determine if an argument is good or sound, is the term that logicians use for a sort of all things considered good argument, we need to ask first, is it valid? And are the premises true? And if the answer to both questions is yes, then we probably have a good argument on our hands. If the answer to either question is no, then the argument's unsound. So all it takes is a no on one or both of those two questions. Toward the end, we're going to talk briefly about a third but related criterion that is hard to know exactly where to fit. I think it fits most neatly under are the premises true, but another way for an argument to be bad. But these are the main two. So a valid argument, remember, is one such that it's impossible for the premises to be true and yet for the conclusion to be false. Less formally, or sort of more intuitively, we want to ask ourselves when we're trying to establish whether an argument is valid, is there a logical gap between the premises and the conclusion? Could I grant the premises for the sake of argument, suppose that they're true, but yet consistent with that deny the conclusion? Or am I forced as a matter of logic, once I grant for the sake of argument that the premises are true, to then accept the conclusion as well? And we can use that as a kind of test, right? Let's begin by assuming, again, just for the sake of argument, this is not, we're not sort of permanently conceding to the egoist that this premise is true, but let's imagine that we conceded that your actions are ultimately motivated by your own desires. Are we then forced, as a matter of sheer logic, to conclude that your actions are ultimately motivated by egoistic desires? Well, no, we're not forced by a matter of logic. Possible there's a possibility here that's being ignored, which is maybe some of your actions are ultimately motivated by altruistic desires. If egoistic desires were the only kinds of desires, then that conclusion would follow. But as we discussed earlier, there's also altruistic desires. And for all we've been told so far, maybe some of those are also ultimate. And so maybe some ultimate motives are altruistic as opposed to egoistic. Then that premise would be true. I have all my desires that motivate my action are mine, but some of them are altruistic. They're still mine, just because they're desires for the promotion of someone else's well-being. It's still a desire I have. And yet it's not the case that everything I do is ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. So this argument is invalid. And what's needed here is another premise to fill the logical gap between the premise and the conclusion. And often this is the way things go when you encounter an invalid argument. If someone's being kind of sloppy in their argumentation in a reading and you're like, this doesn't seem valid, sometimes it's because there's a deep logical mistake. More often than not, though, it's because they've kind of what's called suppressed a premise. They've left a premise out. And you can kind of supply it for them to make the argument logically valid. And then the question turns to, should I buy the premises? What reason do I have to accept the premises? So let's actually do that with this argument. Let's call it revised argument A. We're just going to supply a second premise as a logical bridge between the first premise and the conclusion. So the first premise remains the same, RA1. Your actions are ultimately motivated by your own desires. The second premise now comes in and specifies that all of your ultimate desires are egoistic. If that's given as a premise, then it does indeed follow that therefore your actions are ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. All of your actions are. So this one's valid, and we can tell by doing the same little exercise. Let's grant that all of your actions are ultimately motivated by your desires. Let's also grant this time that all of your ultimate desires are egoistic. And from those two, it does follow that all of your actions are ultimately motivated by egoistic desires, because ultimate motives just are a matter of those ultimate desires that cause your action. So if you grant those two premises, then that conclusion follows. So we have a valid argument for PE here. But of course, that's just a very small part of the battle. The real philosophically interesting work often is in a defender of a controversial view like egoism giving us reasons to accept the premises. Why should I think they're true? Your argument could be valid, but that doesn't matter if I think one of the premises is false. So this first premise, just briefly, this is pretty plausible, right? We kind of already went over why. Yeah, it does seem like no one else's desires could be the motivating causes of your action. But what about this second premise, RA2? All of your ultimate desires are egoistic desires. This effectively says that there are no altruistic desires at the ultimate level. They're all instrumental, all of the altruistic desires. Now, it's not clear why we should think that. I mean, maybe that's true, but maybe not. If you're not an egoist, you're not going to think that. Effectively, if you look at that conclusion, that premise, although it's not exactly word for word the same as the conclusion, it is almost identical to the conclusion. The premise 2 here says all of your ultimate desires are egoistic desires. And the conclusion is that your actions, all of them, are ultimately motivated by egoistic desires. The problem is that the second premise comes so close to just asserting that egoism is true that it's not useful to have as a premise to convince anybody of that conclusion who's not already an egoist. If you are somebody who thinks that acts of great moral heroism, for example, somebody laying down their life for another person, are motivated by that person's desire to further the interests of another for his or her own sake, then you're just going to reject that second premise. You're going to be like, no, not all of a person's ultimate desires are egoistic. Some of them are altruistic. And then you're going to be completely unmoved by this argument. So this brings out another dimension that we want to evaluate arguments along. In addition to knowing whether it's valid and has true premises, in being convinced by the defender of the argument to accept the premises, we want to know whether they're in some way presupposing the truth of the conclusion. If in order to give a defense of the premise, they have to presuppose that the conclusion is true, then they're begging the question. This is sometimes called circular reasoning. In logic, if you take a logic class, there are a lot of different forms of question begging, and it's also not clear why some kinds of question begging are bad and others in other contexts sometimes can be permissible. This is clearly a bad case, one where it's impermissible for the egoist to be giving a question begging argument of this form. For our purposes, though, all that matters is that a question begging argument is one in which the conclusion is either implicitly or explicitly presupposed by one or more of its premises. That's a way for an argument to be bad that doesn't have anything to do with validity and sort of has to do with the truth of the premises, but it's more about whether the defender of the argument can establish that the premises are true without presupposing precisely what they're trying to prove and arguing in a circle. So the upshot of this little exercise is that we've just seen a couple of dimensions, a few different dimensions along which we can evaluate arguments. We've clarified what psychological egoism does and doesn't say, and we're now in a position to go look for and evaluate a better argument for egoism. And that's in the next series of videos.